we possessed not an inkling of the amazing life represented by that stone, a life that had stretched the length and breadth of the continent and spanned the full spectrum of a people's history.
Oh, once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a podcast brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation and hosted by noted writer Lyman, who has chronicled the stories, culture, and character of Utah's Dixie for more than 40 years.
We're sitting here in the studio, the nice air-conditioned studio on a June day. It's probably 105 degrees outside, and I'm remembering those summer days when I was a kid growing up on 600 South in St. George. Those long summer days and us kids in the neighborhood and trying to figure out what to do, how to fill those long, hot hours after dangling our feet in the ditch in the cool water and running through the sprinklers and whatever else we could think of to try to stay cool. Finally, evening would come, and as I remember those days, I realized how much history I was walking through or walking over or really just in the middle of that I really didn't have a clue about. And I wrote a piece some time ago. It's actually a piece that's part of a manuscript that I'm working on right now that came to mind, and I wanted to share it with you. It's about ancestors, and it's about Latter-day Saint history. And I realize that many of our podcast listeners are not members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and maybe don't have a deep interest in the history of the Latter-day Saints. And yet I realize as I've traveled or been in other places, I've found it very important to learn and to know and to understand the stories of the people who founded that place and how it is that that place became the place that it is. And those stories of our Latter-day Saint ancestors really are integral to what this place was, what it has become, and really what it will become. And so I'm hoping that all of our listeners will find something important or something interesting in what I want to share here. It's a piece called On Dark Summer Nights. A half-century ago, on summer evenings, when there was nothing left to do, my friends and I would venture up 6th East toward the St. George Cemetery. Most nights, we didn't make it all the way, but some nights, hearts beating a dirge in our little chests, we would press our way the full 5 blocks to the edge of the giant square where hundreds of gravestones stood silhouetted against the gray dusk. There we would stand, daring each other to hop across the curb and race wildly through the gloom where our ancestors rested 6 feet below the cool grass. We faced mortality square in the face as we weaved through the endless rows of marble markers. They were chiseled in majestic and mysterious shapes. We didn't bother to read the names or note the dates etched deeply in the stone. As evening darkened into night, we would inevitably find ourselves congregated around the most distinctive and fascinating stone on the entire block. It was a giant globe of polished granite, larger than a beach ball, sitting on a handsome pedestal. Something about it beckoned us on those nights when a heart-stopping run through the cemetery could not be resisted. There was a legend among the children of town in those days. I don't know how far back it went, but it had been passed along to us, and it was very serious business. The legend was that if you touched your palm to the giant orb of stone and kept your hand in contact with it as you circled the stone a certain number of times, I don't recall how many, and recited a certain phrase, which I also don't recall, you could then sit down in the darkness and lean back against the stone, and the person buried there would speak to you. I remember doing it at least once, but all I really remember is how scared I was, terrified, and how I jumped up and ran headlong out of the cemetery and didn't miss a stride until I was safely around the corner of 600 South, where the warm golden lights of my house welcomed me. In the innocence or ignorance of youth, I didn't have a clue whose earthly remains lay beneath that stone. It would be many years before I connected the dots and realized that not only was the person buried there one of the most remarkable women in Latter-day Saint history, but also the mother who raised my great-great-grandfather from childhood to his own remarkable adulthood as one of the first Latter-day Saint settlers of southern Utah. Had I possessed even an inkling of whose bones lay 6 feet below me, I would have knelt there in deepest reverence rather than desecrate that holy ground with childish games. I was a grown man before I came to know that that eccentric stone, perhaps the most unusual and remarkable monument in the original St. George Cemetery, marks the grave of my great-great-grandfather's stepmother. She was born Lydia Goldthwaite in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1812. A lovely girl in a happy New England family, she left school at 16 to marry a dapper, popular boy named Calvin Bailey. Life was good for a short time until Bailey's drinking took over. They had one child, and Lydia was pregnant with another when the man abandoned them. Within a year, both children had died. Her spirit broken, Lydia moved to Canada, where she met 2 missionaries preaching the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. One of those missionaries was named Joseph Smith. Overcome by the spirit of their message, she joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and soon found herself in Kirtland, Ohio, where the Latter-day Saints were building a temple. In Kirtland, she met a young father and widower named Newell Knight. Newell's wife, Sally, who in 1832 had given birth to my great-great-grandfather Samuel Knight, had died soon after the birth and death of her second child. Newell was a devout Latter-day Saint whose father, Joseph Knight Sr., had been one of the earliest friends and supporters of Joseph Smith. Now Newell found himself in a hopeless situation as he tried to raise his young son Samuel while working to build up the church and facing the relentless persecution of the Latter-day Saints in Ohio and Missouri. Beautiful, strong-willed, and brave, Lydia seemed a godsend. At the time, Lydia was not certain what had become of her first husband, Calvin Bailey. If he was alive, she was still legally married to him. She wished very much to marry Newell, but saw no way out of her predicament. Newell asked Joseph Smith to seek the Lord's direction for them. Joseph prayed in their behalf and told them the Lord approved of their marriage. They were married in Kirtland in 1835, the first marriage performed by Joseph Smith. It wasn't long before Lydia learned that Calvin Bailey had indeed died. After the Kirtland Temple's dedication in April of 1836, Newell wanted to take his new bride to Missouri, where the extended Knight family was dealing with all the turmoil there. Joseph Smith, who had always been close with the Knights, was concerned about Newell's difficult financial situation. He asked what resources Newell had for the 1,000-mile journey to Clay County. Newell understatedly replied, "We are rather cramped." Here, we need to drop back for a moment. The life of Lydia Goldthwaite Knight, the woman whose mortal remains rested beneath the mysterious gravestone that beguiled me as a little boy, was one of the great unsung women of the Restoration. As a very young widow, she began sustaining Joseph Smith's prophetic calling as soon as her feet hit the ground in Kirtland in 1835. She was 22 years old and desired passionately to gather with the saints there. No sooner had she arrived than she was approached by a man who told her the prophet was in peril and needed financial support, and anything she could give would be a benefit to him. It had been nearly a year since Joseph Smith had personally taught her the gospel in Canada. He had baptized her and had come to know the tragic story of her marriage at 16, the death of her 2 children, and how she'd been abandoned by a deceitful husband. As the prophet had left her in Canada, he blessed her and told her, "Sister Lydia, the Lord, your Savior, loves you and will overrule all your past sorrows and afflictions for good. Be comforted and let your heart rejoice, for the Lord has a great work for you to do. Be faithful and endure unto the end, and all will be well." So, when asked now to give of her means to benefit him, she said, "Here is all I have. I only wish it were more." She emptied her purse of the $50 it contained. It was all the money her parents had given her to travel and to begin her new life in Kirtland. As she handed the money to the man, she was left with nothing, not even the means to buy her supper that night or to rent a place to lie her head. The man who was collecting the money to free Joseph Smith from jail was Vincent Knight. He offered Lydia a place to stay, and it wasn't long before she met another member of the Knight family named Newell. Newell's parents, my great-grandparents Joseph and Polly Knight, had befriended Joseph Smith in 1825 when he was 19 years old and still being tutored by the angel Moroni. Joseph Knight had believed and connected with Joseph Smith's story from the moment he first heard it. On September 27, 1827, after 4 years of preparation, Joseph Smith was ready to receive the plates from which he would translate the Book of Mormon. Joseph Knight was staying with the Smiths at the time. Joseph and Emma borrowed his horse and wagon to go to the hill Cumorah that night. In Joseph Knight's wagon, they transported the plates back to the Smith farm. Later, Joseph Knight supplied some of the precious paper needed for the translation and often made sure Joseph had enough to eat while translating. When the Book of Mormon was published in 1830 and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was formally organized on April 6th of that year, 21 people came into the church through the Knight family. They formed the core of the Colesville, New York branch of the church, and they remained loyal and committed not only to the church, but to the prophet through all the turmoil to come. Years later, in Nauvoo, when Joseph Smith was feeling overwhelmed by the hatred and harassment of his enemies, he recorded the names of those who had stood by him in every hour of his peril. One of those names was his aged and beloved brother, Joseph Knight Sr., who, he said, was among the first to administer to my necessities in the work of the restoration. "He has ever been faithful and true," wrote Joseph Smith. "Behold, he is a righteous man, and his name shall never be forgotten." There is his son Newell Knight and his other son Joseph Knight Jr., whose names I record in the book of the law of the Lord with unspeakable delight, for they are my friends. And so it was that Lydia's name became synonymous with the Knights, and most likely entered into that same book, as she gave of her means for the prophet in a time of need. Now the shoe was on the other foot, as Newell and his new wife prepared to leave Kirtland for Missouri with the most meager of resources. The prophet looked at Lydia and said, "I have not forgotten how generously you helped me when I was in trouble." He then handed the couple almost twice as much money as Lydia had given him. They survived the abysmal persecutions in Missouri and moved on with the saints to Nauvoo. Newell, who had helped build the temple in Kirtland, was called again to help build the temple in Nauvoo. Like many of the others who came to Nauvoo, Lydia was stricken with malaria. She asked Newell to take a white handkerchief to Joseph Smith with complete faith that if the prophet could bless it and return it to her, she would get well. But she only grew worse, and fearing death, she asked her husband to go see Joseph again. That was when Newell confessed that he hadn't dared bother Joseph the first time because of all that was asked of him by the saints. This time, Joseph blessed the handkerchief and assured him Lydia would recover. And she did. As my cousin Bruce Hafen put it in his book, The Contrite Spirit, Newell and Lydia's continued trust in the Lord, in each other, and in Joseph kept them close to the sources of grace. 3 months after being sealed in the Nauvoo temple, Lydia and Newell fled the city with their 7 children. It was the spring of 1846. They camped with the Ponca Indians the next winter, planning to continue west the next spring. In January of that winter, Newell got sick. It started on a bitter winter night with an acute pain in his side. No remedy could give him relief. Over the course of 7 days and nights, Lydia watched her husband's life slowly cease. In his dying words, he told Lydia it was necessary for him to go. "Don't grieve too much," he whispered, "for you will be protected." Lydia pleaded for him not to give up. He told her Joseph wanted him on the other side. "I could not bear it," she said. "Think of me, Newell, here with 7 little children. I cannot let you go." Lydia writhed in pain along with him as he tried to hang on. Finally, she prayed for forgiveness if she had asked amiss. She released him to God's will, and within moments his pain ceased and he was gone. Now it all seemed impossible to Lydia. How would she prepare her fatherless family for the trek west? And she was expecting another baby. Sometime later, in the middle of a sleepless night, she called out for her lost husband. Newell visited her in a vision with a smile on his face and said, "Be calm. Let not sorrow overcome you. I was needed behind the veil. You cannot fully comprehend it now, but the time will come when you shall know why I left you and our little ones. Therefore, dry up your tears. Be patient. I will go before you and protect you in your journeyings. Although the ravens of the valley should feed you and your little ones, you shall not perish for the want of bread." Lydia had received her patriarchal blessing from Joseph Smith Sr. just after her marriage to Newell in Kirtland. The blessing affirmed that the Lord has given thee a kind and loving companion for thy comfort. Your souls shall be knit together, and nothing shall separate you. Angels shall minister unto thee. Thy heart shall be comforted. And yet her heart continued to cry out in sorrow as her burden seemed more than she could bear. Soon after her baby was born, she called out to Newell again as rain ran through the roof of her cabin, soaking the bedclothes. He came to her again and again promised her protection. Even in those cold and wet and most miserable of circumstances, a pleasant warmth came over her. When her youngest son Hiram was pulled from a creek after seeming to have drowned, Lydia called for the elders to bless him. It appeared to everyone present it was too late. There was no breath in the boy. She held the child to her breast and convinced the brethren to lay their hands on the lifeless child and pray for him. Life did return, and the child began to breathe. As Bruce Hafen put it, the Lord continually extended his grace to Lydia Knight because she continually sustained the building of his kingdom, and his kingdom was built to sustain his covenant people. By 1848, a year after the original pioneers had arrived in the valley of the Great Salt Lake, Lydia felt she was ready to embark on the trail west. But Brigham Young, who counseled directly with her, felt she should further establish herself financially before setting out. Instead, and ironically, he asked her if she felt disposed to do so, to contribute her 3 yoke of oxen and 2 wagons to fit out someone else who might be in a better position to take care of themselves once they reached the valley of the Great Salt Lake. As difficult as it must have been to put off her plans, she told Brigham her oxen and wagons were at his disposal. She remained at winter quarters with her 8 children in a half-cave, half-hut on the bank of a creek. The dwelling flooded when it rained, was cold in winter and stifling hot in summer, and impossible to keep clean. Yet there she stayed. So much grief had already touched her, she later wrote. She knew how to fit joy into the corners. It wasn't until 1850 that she and her children finally headed west to join the Saints in Utah. To do so, she had to borrow $50 to rent the oxen needed for the journey. It would take 2 years of work to repay the debt. The cow she brought across the plains produced the first milk they churned into butter once they reached the valley. They gave that first pound of butter to the bishop for tithing. Not knowing how much butter she'd be able to make, she wanted to pay the first tenth rather than the last. Lydia Knight had arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, a widow with 8 children, in 1850. She entered into a difficult and short third marriage to John Dalton, with whom she had 1 more child. After the divorce, she taught school to support her family. Then she met James McClellan, a prosperous widower who had 2 daughters who dearly needed a mother. They lived in Payson, Utah, then moved to Santa Clara, where her stepson, my great-great-grandfather Samuel Knight, was serving as a missionary with Jacob Hamlin. After 20 years of happy marriage, Lydia was widowed once again in 1880. By now, she was comfortable financially, and she established her home in St. George, where she spent her final years serving in the St. George Temple. Of those days in the temple, she wrote, eternity seemed only a footstep away. She did the ordnance work for more than 700 of her deceased family members and friends. One day in April of 1884, she had breakfast, went to the temple to complete the work for the last family name in her possession, and came home not feeling well. That night, she took that footstep into eternity. A couple of days later, her mortal remains would have been lowered into her grave just a few blocks from the temple, in the same neighborhood where I would be born 71 years later. A most remarkable monument stone was placed at the head of the grave. It was the same shiny orb of granite my friends and I encountered 8 decades later, when we had no greater care in the world and nothing better to do than tromp up Fifth East in St. George all the way to the cemetery and play irreverently around that stone. As dusk darkened into night, we sought some childish thrill with no reckoning who it was that lay there. We possessed not an inkling of the amazing life represented by that stone, a life that had stretched the length and breadth of the continent and spanned the full spectrum of a people's history, darkest fear to brightest courage, highest joy to deepest tragedy, and ultimately grace. Lydia Goldthwait, Bailey, Knight, Dalton, McClellan was buried in that little plot of earth where a half-century ago I played on summer nights, my heart pounding without a clue.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.